In the cultural landscape of medieval Western Europe, one enigmatic character stood apart from his contemporaries. Heavily influenced by the unequivocal Christian worldview, in which creation was divided among moral lines between God and his righteous followers on one hand, and Satan and his fallen devotees on the other, little room was left for nuance, a facet reflected in most well-known cultural figures of the time. The just and noble king, benevolent mother, and brave, chivalrous knight serve as clear examples of good archetypes, each embodying traits and lifestyles celebrated in medieval European society, while likewise the traitor, tyrant, and seductress remained firmly on the side of villainy. But in this age and atmosphere of stark, black and white moral distinction, one particular character managed to straddle the boundary between celebration and revilement, an agent of change and seeker of pleasure, occasionally working in service to a greater cause, while always advancing his own interests. Clever, manipulative, and above all unpredictable, the archetypal trickster, Reynard the Fox. Perhaps no other animal has managed to captivate human interest more than the wolf, the wild ancestor and counterpart to the very dogs whose domestication helped ensure our own species' ascent. Wolves serve as a lasting symbol of the primal, untamed wilderness that eludes humanity's grasp, of the dangers that lurk just beyond the reach of our fires and fastness of our walls. To pre-modern man across much of the globe, the wolf was an enemy, savage and fierce, the most likely challenger to our own dominion over the planet. But this adversarial existence was only heightened by the cultural history of Christian Europe, which itself developed out of the pastoral Judaic culture of the Near East. For no man has more reason to fear and despise the wolf than the shepherd, whose docile livestock, stripped of many of their natural defenses by the process of domestication, make a tempting meal for any predator brave enough to challenge mankind. As animal fables began to take root in the ancient Mediterranean world, certain species found themselves ascribed with particular traits by their human observers. The lion, powerful and majestic, became associated with kingship, the snake who sheds his skin a symbol of death, rebirth, medicine, and immortality, the goose with foolishness and clumsiness. Naturally, the wolf became defined in the human imagination by its predatory appetite, often cast as a threat to the other inhabitants of the wild since the earliest days of the beast fable tradition. These fables, many of which have parallels from the Middle East to India, and may in some cases have even been derived from such remote lands, were typically intended to impart some simple moral lesson to the listeners. Most people in the Western world will be familiar with the tales attributed to the Greek slave Aesop, such as the fox and the grapes or the tortoise and the hare, from the time they are children. But given the vast distances and time periods across which these stories were transmitted, often in oral form, such fables were liable to change, as did the characters who inhabited them. While the wolf originally enjoyed a more nuanced reputation, as Christianity spread westward across the Roman Empire, and the empire itself subsequently collapsed and fragmented over the following centuries, the wolf became a symbol of unadulterated evil, a sinful beast preying on the metaphorical flock of Christ. In a similar fashion, the serpent saw itself transition from being associated with medicine, alchemy, and esoteric rituals into a personification of the devil himself, owing to its associations with the temptation of Eve in Eden from the opening passages of Genesis. The owl, regarded as a messenger of the wise goddess Athena, became a herald of death and blindness, while the stag, previously associated with pagan hunting practices, came to be regarded as a symbol of spiritual elevation for its leadership of deer herds and regeneration of its antlers, as well as the sacrificial nature by which it died to feed its typically highborn hunters. But throughout all this turmoil, across vast gulfs of time, culture, and geography, one species retained its classical attributes. Vulpes vulpes, the red fox. A taxonomical little cousin to the gray wolf who demanded such fear and awe from humanity, the red fox is not possessed of the size, strength, or ferocity of the wolf, nor availed by the benefits of its larger counterpart's social nature. While gray wolves hunt in packs that can exceed more than a dozen members, and indeed may have grown much larger in the less developed ancient world, thereby deriving security and support from their companions in facing the challenges of a wild existence, The red fox is a solitary species, abandoning its lone lifestyle only during the mating and pup-rearing seasons. Unable to resort to brute force or the aid of numerous companions, the fox must instead rely on the advantage with which it has become intimately associated among human beings: a cunning mind. Foxes have long been noted for their cleverness, to the point that wherever they are found across the globe, local human cultures will have inevitably associated them with trickery and wit. And while initially, the fox of European fables lived in the shadow of his more powerful cousin, he possessed an advantage that would suit him well as human civilization continued its inexorable march: the ability to adapt. While wolves require large amounts of wild territory on which to survive, and thereby found themselves struggling as their forests and fields were settled, their prey slaughtered or corralled, and their two-legged foes developed ever more creative methods of dealing death and destruction, the fox quietly slipped into the cracks and crevices of human civilization, slinking from shadow to shadow, sustaining himself on the ample refuse and livestock that his neighbors so graciously and unwittingly provided. Scholars are uncertain as to why exactly the fox overtook the wolf in the popularity of medieval folklore. Perhaps it was that the gray wolf's diminishing domain brought the species into contact with humanity less frequently, and when contact did occur, it was often violent, desperate, and terrifying. The fox, on the other hand, while still an adversary of man, was not a danger so much as a nuisance, occasionally making off with a hen or duck, but presenting little threat to human life, and its resourceful, clever ability to outwit and deceive its foes had to merit at least some admiration. Where the wolf was widely condemned from scripture to chivalric romance as a vicious killer and minion of Satan, the reputation of the fox proved more nuanced, his crimes less damning, his charm and cunning worthy of begrudging respect. But whatever the reasons, in the end the fox found himself triumphing against the wolf not only in the changing ecosystem of the European continent, but in the realm of its ruler's imagination as well. By the middle of the 12th century AD, the landscape of Europe had changed dramatically from the time of the animal fable's origins. Christianity had swept across the continent, adapting and reshaping the cultural beliefs and practices its adherents encountered, while the Roman Empire had long since crumbled into myriad competing feudal states. Medieval audiences, both aristocratic and lowborn, had become enamored with tales of courtly intrigue and chivalric romance, and through this, the old Greco-Roman fables that had long lurked in the public consciousness would find new life. In the county of Flanders, located in present-day western Belgium, at the midpoint of the 12th century, a poet typically identified as Nivardus adapted the characters and stories descended from classical fables into a Latin mock epic, or parody of conventional chivalric narratives of the time. These tales, titled Isengrimus, featured anthropomorphic animals, or animals with humanoid physical and mental attributes, and set the groundwork for one of the most popular and influential cycles of the Middle Ages. The central story of Isengrimus concerns the titular character, a wolf whose various schemes and adventures bring him into conflict with Reynardus, a clever fox likewise plucked from classical Greco-Roman fables. While it is unknown to what extent these two characters existed in this form before Nivardus wrote down tales of their exploits, the Isengrimus marks the first usage of these figures' distinctive names and traits in the written historical record. The name Isengrimus is derived from Eisen, meaning iron, and Grimus, or fierce. But the origins of Reynardus are not as clear. While it is widely agreed upon that the second half of the name is derived from a word meaning hard or strong, the first element, rein, remains a matter of some dispute. Most scholars believe that this name is a corruption of Reinohardus, or strong in counsel, an archaic way of saying wise or cunning. Two less prominent theories include rein referring to a reign of strikes or blows, or the reign of the old Germanic pagan gods. Whatever the origins of the latter's name, Isengrimus and Reynardus embody one of the most common motifs found not only in European culture, but far beyond the continent, that of the opposition between strength and cunning, with the clever fox almost always managing to get the better of his stronger, more imposing cousin. And while the Isengrimus does feature several distinct tales and elements, Many of the episodes within this mock epic are simply retellings of archaic fables adapted to a medieval setting, such as The Fox and the Sick Lion, which shifts from a wilderness setting to a royal court, but features the same outcome. The clever fox, summoned before the lion, king of beasts, is ordered to find a cure for His Majesty's illness, at which point he suggests treatments that harm or otherwise disadvantage his numerous enemies. But while the wolf was undoubtedly the central character of this earliest incarnation of the medieval beast epic, audiences appeared to gravitate towards his nemesis, who, in classic trickster fashion, would soon upstage his stronger rival. For roughly 2 decades later and 400 kilometers to the southeast, in the region of Lorraine in eastern France, Pierre Descéclus would publish his own version of the Isengrimus, promoting the fox to the status of protagonist. In the process of adapting the chief characters' names into the author's native Lorraine tongue, Isengrimus became Isengrim, and Reynardus became Reynard. And while the nature of medieval record-keeping, oral transmission of folklore, lack of widespread literacy, and general upheaval of the time period can make it difficult to identify where exactly the distinctive character of Reynard truly originated, scholars generally seem to agree that this most enigmatic fox was born, so to speak, in the folklore of Lorraine, from where he spread to the surrounding regions before returning in more proper form through the writings of Descéclus. In what has become known as the Roman des Renards, or Reynardian cycle, the titular character lives in a kingdom populated by anthropomorphic animals, though regular humans do also live around and amongst them. The central character, naturally, is Reynard the Fox himself, a cunning, manipulative, downright sociopathic trickster who uses his wiles to get the better of his neighbors, escape trouble, and benefit himself and his family time and time again. Arriving at court among his many accusers, Reynard conducted himself as if he hadn't a care in the world. He proceeded straight through the main gate and, standing directly before the king, addressed him thusly: "God grant you great honor and renown. Never did a king have a more faithful servant than I have been, and remain, to your grace. I nonetheless happen to know that there are many in this court who would destroy me, if only you would believe them. Thanks be to God that it is beneath your crown lightly to accredit these liars. We should complain to God himself that these deceptive flatterers are most credited in lords' courts. These same villains are promoted so as to damage the good, and the Lord God will in time see that justice is done." While the supporting cast could vary, some of the most prominent reoccurring characters include Noble the Lion, the corrupt, greedy, and easily swayed king of the realm, Isengrim the Wolf, Reynard's uncle and chief rival, whose advantage in strength rarely avails him against his nephew, Isengrim's wife Hyacinthe the She-Wolf, who finds herself caught up in her husband's rivalry with the fox, Chanticleer the Rooster, whose large family often falls victim to Reynard's predations, Tibert the Cat and Runel the Dog, 2 loyal servants of King Noble, the powerful but lazy and dim-witted Bruin the Bear, Ermelin, the loyal wife of Reynard and mother of his numerous children, Ruchena the She-Ape, a scholar and aunt to Reynard who, along with her numerous kin, many of whom hold church offices, comes to the fox's defense in his times of need, and Grimbard the Badger, Reynard's supposed nephew, who often aids the fox's schemes. The traits of these characters are based on a combination of contemporary wildlife observations and popular assumptions about the behavior and spiritual significance of various species. For example, Grimbard the Badger's alliance with Reynard appears to be founded in the very real phenomenon of badgers and foxes occasionally sharing meals and even living spaces, while Reynard's character is derived from medieval European folklore, which associated the fox, with its fiery coat and cunning, predatory nature, with the 7 deadly sins and the devil. In a similar manner, apes, who were viewed as an embodiment of the base, sinful nature of spiritually unenlightened man, are frequently cast as supporters of Reynard and his wicked schemes. This cycle of stories is set in a medieval European-style kingdom inspired by Lorraine and the Low Countries, though adaptations do from time to time localize some of the place names, as they do with those of the cast. Most of the tales take place either at King Noble's court, where Reynard is accused of myriad crimes before having to defend himself, or around Reynard's family castle of Malperdu, or Malperdy, a labyrinthian series of tunnels within which the fox can escape and outlast his foes. Most scholars believe this name to be a corruption of the French word for St. John's wort, millepertuis, a weed often used in folk medicines at the time. In William Caxton's English translation, he renders the keep's name as Wicked Hole, though whether this was a result of mistranslating from Latin or simply taking creative liberties is unknown. While the stories themselves can vary wildly, a few central tales are found in nearly every iteration of the Roman de Renard. The most prominent of these is Reynard's summons to the court of King Noble the Lion, after nearly every other animal in the kingdom levels accusations against him. Isengrim accuses Reynard of having had an affair with his wife, while several others charge the fox with theft, assault, or deception. Reynard's nephew Grimbart answers all of these accusations in masterful legal fashion, pointing out that Reynard had treated Isengrim's wife well during their dalliance, and that the wolf should not slander his wife's name in such a manner regardless. The badger also notes that the items Reynard stole from other animals were in turn stolen by them from humans, while the alleged assault against Kuert the hare, which occurred while the fox was in the guise of a clergyman, is justified as merely a form of stern religious instruction. However, just as Reynard's name appears to have been cleared, Chanticleer the rooster arrives bearing the body of one of his daughters, who fell victim to Reynard's predation. Enraged, King Noble demands that the fox be summoned to answer for his crimes, and dispatches a series of messengers to bring this about, only for the first two to be duped through their own failings. Realizing the severity of the situation, and wishing to avoid a siege of his uncle's keep, Grimbart himself persuades Reynard to come to court, where the fox is promptly arrested and sentenced to death. After feigning piety, he is granted the right to make a public confession before his hanging, whereupon he spins a wild tale of an elaborate conspiracy against the king involving a stash of hidden treasure, naming his many foes as traitors and himself as a brave and loyal subject, playing on the king's greed and pride and the queen's paranoia and cluelessness. Upon providing evidence that he himself cleverly staged, Reynard is pardoned and manages to escape back to his castle, where he quickly reverts to his wicked ways. And when word of these new transgressions reaches the king, Reynard quickly constructs another ploy to win back Noble's favor. In the end, after his aunt Rukenau the she-ape gives stirring testimony in his defense, and the fox himself defeats Isengrim in a duel by utilizing very underhanded methods, Reynard becomes the king's chief counselor, returning home victorious after once again escaping justice. It is important to note that, especially in the earliest incarnations of his character, Reynard is by no means even remotely moral. Throughout the tales of his various exploits, he lies, steals, mutilates, rapes, and murders those who come across his path without remorse, serving only himself and his family at the expense of all others. But then why, in the devout Christian landscape of medieval Western Europe, did this character, an embodiment of every imaginable vice, become so popular? Part of his appeal likely lay in the absurdist elements of the stories themselves, which featured animals engaging in human-like behavior and parodied the highly popular chivalric romances of the time. In addition, the celebration of such a despicable character almost certainly played on its taboo nature, of the seemingly ubiquitous appeal of doing, saying, or laughing at something that is supposed to be forbidden. In this way, the Reynard stories can be seen as the medieval equivalent of edgy humor, managing to both shock and delight audiences with how ribald, daring, and irreverent the tales were in their violation of conventional norms. And perhaps, in a cultural landscape rife with tales of blessed saints and virtuous knights, certain listeners and readers found some catharsis in encountering tales that better reflected their own experiences. That the world was a brutal place where success was most often achieved through vicious, cold-hearted cunning. Additionally, even from the beginning, these tales included elements of satire and social commentary, presenting the nobility and clergy as either corrupt or incompetent, if not both, and incidentally making Reynard, despite his apparent aristocratic status, into a sort of peasant hero for those dissatisfied with the rigid and unyielding power structures of the time. The fox himself often assumes the attire and mannerisms of a member of the church in order to deceive others, most of whom are easily fooled, and subsequently taken advantage of. I hear that the prelates and rich curates preach one thing, but think and do altogether another. So I learn that lies are most commonly found in the courts of nobles. Lords, ladies, priests, and scholars are the grandest liars. Men daren't tell lords the truth today. Wherever a failing is to be found, I must flatter and lie, or else have the door shut on me. I've often heard men say the truth, who with a lie make their argument conform better to their intention, so when the lie is well dressed, it falls into step with the truth. Men have to flatter, threaten, beg, and curse. They must strike at their opponent's weakest point. Whoever intends to prosper in the world without composing an artful deception, without cloaking his lie so that men take it for truth, has no hope of escaping defeat. Centuries after the first tales of Reynard coalesced in the folklore of eastern France, Italian diplomat and political theorist Niccolò Machiavelli would argue that the most effective method of achieving and maintaining power lay not in abiding by any moral or ethical code, but rather in appearing to abide by a code in the eyes of others. And while his infamous treatise would shock many of his contemporaries and inspire vigorous discourse for decades to come, the harsh realities Machiavelli identified had already been alluded to in the exploits of a certain legendary fox, albeit from behind the shield of irony and satire, rather than being presented as genuine political advice. But beyond even this, Reynard's foes almost always fall victim to his trickery due to some failing, usually moral, on their own part. Were it not for the pride, greed, gluttony, ignorance, and incompetence of his fellow animals, many of Reynard's neighbors would easily have escaped from their encounters with him unscathed. For those aspiring to morality, the nature of Reynard's victims would hold some hope that they themselves might elude harm by their virtue, while those of a more cynical persuasion might find comfort, or at least amusement, in the idea that in a world populated by corrupt, greedy, self-centered rulers and clueless, short-sighted, easily manipulated peasants, Reynard simply plays the hand he is dealt. Though the Roman de Renard originated in Lorraine, Reynard the Fox would soon find his exploits being celebrated across the continent under a variety of localized derivative names. In Holland, he would become Reinhard, in Luxembourg, Reinert, in western France, Renard, and in the Italian states, Reinaldo. East beyond the Rhine, German-speaking audiences would know him as Reineke, while through Chaucer he would be introduced to the English as Rossel, so named for the distinctive red coat of his species. In time, the figure would become so popular in France that the original French word for fox, goupil, derived from the Latin vulpes, would be supplanted with renard, a legacy that endures to this day. And as the crafty fox's fame spread, so too did the content of his character, and the meaning he carried, transform. The earliest incarnations of the Reynard cycle, much like the fables that preceded and influenced them, contain simplistic moral messaging, with Reynard embodying everything that a moral person should aspire to avoid being: deceitful, selfish, vindictive, violent, and indulgent, concerned only with worldly prosperity. Many early editions of the Roman de Renard contain introductions, afterwords, and asides from the narrator advising audiences to see the wickedness of Reynard's ways, and admonishing, often vaguely, the real-life counterparts to the flawed animal characters who populated these beast epics. When William Caxton, an English merchant with considerable connections in the Low Countries, earned a fortune bringing a broader array of Reynardian stories to the attention of the British public, he ended his translation with a note lamenting that the world is now dominated by fox-like humans. There are many Reynards these days. He has left many heirs of his craftiness in the world. They always grow powerful, because whoever refuses to practice Reynard's craft counts for nothing in the world in any estate that matters. If one is able to skulk like Reynard, and has been Reynard's pupil, he then knows how to prosper, and is promoted above every competitor. It might seem strange to hear such damning words for morality and virtue, but it must be remembered that, especially in the context of Christian medieval Europe, a distinction was often made between earthly power and prosperity, associated with Satan, sin, and the fallen nature of mankind, and the eternal reward of heaven that was to be attained through humility, self-sacrifice, and nobly enduring the suffering of the physical world. As Jesus himself, revered in Christianity as the Son of God and second person in the Christian Trinity, states in the Gospel of Matthew, "Again I say to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." But, as even certain people of the time noted, many supposedly devout figures in the nobility and clergy often swaddled themselves in the comforts of wealth and material possession from which they were supposed to abstain. And herein lies the path to Reynard's transformation in the public consciousness. For while he originally began as an icon of sin and an embodiment of the worst attributes of human beings, Reynard soon found himself undergoing the processes of subversive appropriation and symbolic transformation. It is often said that the only constant in life is change, and as the beliefs, values, and circumstances of a culture develop and transform over time, so too does their associated iconography. Appropriation is the process by which a symbol associated with a certain meaning is deliberately adopted by others for a new type of usage. Perhaps the most infamous example of this is the case of the swastika, employed for millennia by cultures around the world as a symbol of good luck, happiness, spiritual enlightenment, the sun, and infinity, only to be adopted by the National Socialist German Workers' Party in 1920, resulting in it now, at least in the Western world, being nearly unequivocally associated with fascism, anti-Semitism, and white supremacy. An older instance involves the phoenix, long associated with the sun, immortality, and resurrection in the ancient world on account of its supposed ability to be reborn from the ashes of its own funeral pyre, which was adopted by early Christians due to its symbolic associations with Christ. A more humorous example of this process is with the song Yankee Doodle, which was originally devised by British soldiers to mock less organized colonial infantry, only to be enthusiastically adopted by the regulars of the Continental Army during the American Revolution. This specifically is an example of subversive appropriation, by which the symbol in question is given a new meaning or employed in a new usage that deliberately contradicts or challenges what it was originally intended to represent. The related process of transformation occurs when a symbol gradually acquires new meaning or sheds old associations over time, such as with European views on the owl. Originally regarded as an embodiment of wisdom in ancient Greece due to its associations with the goddess Athena, in the Middle Ages it came to be associated with darkness, blindness, and death on account of its nocturnal habits, as well as being viewed as symbolic of the minority Jewish populations scattered throughout Christendom, before reacquiring its sage status in recent times. Transformation and appropriation frequently go hand in hand, and the line between the two processes is often murky, but generally, the former occurs naturally and over longer periods of time, while the latter involves more agency and intention, and occurs much more quickly. And like many other iconic cultural figures and symbols throughout history, the trickster fox would see his image adapted to suit the changing times. As the continent grappled with the dual nature of the rigid aristocratic order and centralized power of the Catholic Church, Reynard the Fox found himself being used by both the Old Guard and reformists seeking to enact broader religious and political change. When 13th century Dutch poet Willem de Maroc-Mechta adapted the cycle into Middle Dutch as Van den Vos Reynerde, he sharpened the satire of contemporary institutions, particularly with regards to the church, staffing it with sinful, corrupt apes who often conspire with the devious fox. It was this version of the Roman de Renard that would serve as the basis for most subsequent Dutch, German, and English language translations over the coming centuries. Beginning in the mid-1300s, numerous proto-Protestant movements arose among the peasantry and lay clergy across Western Europe as a result of disenchantment with the centralized authority, strict hierarchical nature, vast material wealth, and accumulation of political power of the Roman Catholic Church. One of the most influential figures of these movements, English preacher John Wycliffe, ended up helping to spark the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which occurred in the aftermath of a wave of the bubonic plague during a lull in the 100 Years' War. During this highly tumultuous time, tales of Reynard became increasingly popular among the disaffected peasantry, and the fox's propensity for donning the guise of a monk or abbot in order to better deceive and manipulate his victims came to be seen as an expression of the truth behind corruption, decadence, and hypocrisy in church officials. In particular, proto-Protestant movements took issue with the practices of simony, or the selling of church offices, indulgences, or financial contributions made to clergymen in order to expedite the forgiveness of one's sins, and the reluctance of the Church to translate the Bible from Latin into local languages, which limited the ability of commoners to engage directly with Scripture by necessitating priests as middlemen. In response, the Catholic Church began to use Reynard in propaganda of their own, portraying Wycliffe's followers, known derogatorily as Lollards, as duplicitous foxes out to lead the peasantry away from the path of righteousness. But while these earlier uses of Reynard in satire and critique still cast the fox in a villainous light, his determined resistance to often corrupt authority and unabashed surety of his own ability and nature would see him begin to win genuine admiration from not only wide swaths of the European peasantry, but even reform-minded individuals of higher status. In one of the German states near the birthplace of the famous fox, Alsatian poet Heinrich der Glichenseere published his own interpretation of the Roman de Renard, using it to criticize the reigning Hohenstaufen dynasty of the Holy Roman Empire. In this version, instead of merely being confirmed as King Noble's chief counselor, and thereby being able to rule through him, Reynard outright poisons the lion and assumes the throne directly. As religious and political upheaval spread across the continent in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, as well as the accompanying Counter-Reformation and devastating wars of religion, Reynard increasingly found himself beloved by the commoners, particularly those of a Protestant or revolutionary persuasion. Gradually shedding the unsavory image he had been born with, the wily fox became associated with daring mockery of the powerful and clever resistance to tyranny, assuming the role of an unorthodox agent of justice before whom no individual, no matter how mighty or revered, was safe from having their flaws exposed. Having lived so long in the folklore of Western Europe, with the rise of nationalism and revolutionary fervor in the 18th and 19th centuries, Reynard's exploits would be adapted by numerous authors into localized national epics, such as German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Reineke Fuchs, published in 1794, and Michael Rodange's Renet oder de Fuß am Frakener Mannsgeist, widely cited as the magnum opus of Luxembourgish literature. Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche would even cite Reynard, alongside the esteemed Socrates, as one of the premier dialecticians in Twilight of the Idols, writing, "Does he, a creature suffering under oppression, enjoy his innate ferocity in the knife thrusts of the syllogism? Does he wreak his revenge on the noblemen he fascinates? As a dialectician, a man has a merciless instrument to wield. He can play the tyrant with it. He leaves it to his opponent to prove that he is no idiot. He infuriates, and likewise paralyzes." By the waning years of the 19th century, Reynard had all but shed the sinful, malevolent, and transgressive nature of his youth, to the point where rather than evoking a sense of shock and outrage, his exploits had become commonplace in children's stories. But the fox would see one final, bizarre attempt to appropriate his image in the coming years. When the Nazi legions marched across Europe, conquering and plundering the continent's rich cultural heritage for symbols they could commandeer to their cause, even crafty old Reynard found himself in their crosshairs. In the late 1930s, as the Nazi Party was consolidating its iron grip over every aspect of German society, several neighboring countries saw fascist movements of their own spring up in its wake. In the Netherlands, Belgian-born lawyer, writer, and fascist politician Robert van Genechten hoped to utilize the classic trickster for his own purposes. In 1937, he published Van den Vos Reynerde, a retelling of the Roman de Renard in which Noble the Lion was replaced by the anti-Semitic caricature Jodocus the Rhinoceros, whose attempts to integrate the various animal species and transform his kingdom into a republic are presented as defying the natural order. In this, he is opposed by Reynard the Fox and his allies, who end up murdering the foreign-born prime minister and his supporters in a coup d'état. After the German occupation of the Netherlands began in 1940, it should be no surprise that Van Genechten was quick to become a collaborationist. And with their obvious status as thinly veiled propaganda, his incarnation of the Reynard stories naturally came to the attention of Nazi officials. The Dutch puppet government soon set to work on an animated adaptation of Van den Vos Reynerde, but the production would find itself plagued by problems. While the film secured a sizable budget despite the ongoing war effort, many prominent Dutch fascist officials took issue with the idea of Reynard, long seen as a symbol of vice and resistance to authority, being cast in the role of hero, while others doubted the story's effectiveness as an instrument of propaganda. Despite being completed in 1943 with significant financial assistance from a then beleaguered Nazi Germany, the film was never publicly shown, and ended up being lost for decades before its piecemeal rediscovery by the German Bundesarchiv in the 1990s and early 2000s. Van Genechten's fortunes would likewise dwindle as the Second World War dragged on. After the failure of his adaptation, he would see himself demoted by his Nazi superiors before attempting suicide, which would result in his removal from office entirely. During the subsequent liberation of the Netherlands, he and many of his compatriots were quickly arrested and sentenced to death for treason and complicity in crimes against humanity, whereupon he hanged himself in his prison cell rather than face execution. Amidst all this devastation and suffering, however, Reynard would escape this attempted conscription unscathed. And so, from a certain point of view, it might be said that the fox had the last laugh. Over the last few decades, with the rise of mass media and an explosion in the number of franchises competing for interest in the world of popular culture, Reynard the Fox has gradually slunk back into the shadows of the public consciousness. But even so, his influences can be seen to this day. The Roman de Renard continues to be retold for modern audiences and adapted into animated features, shorts, and TV shows in various Western European countries, and its eponymous anti-hero not uncommonly makes cameos or finds himself referenced in numerous novels and comics. Even the dominant force in Western animation, Walt Disney Studios, contemplated adapting the Roman de Renard into an animated feature in the 1940s, though production faltered due to the company's founders' concerns that Reynard's villainous, subversive nature would not befit the studio's family-friendly brand. However, character designs by veteran Disney writer and art director Ken Anderson would end up being reused for the studio's later adaptation of the classic English tales of Robin Hood, with the cunning rebel protagonist portrayed as a fox, the feckless king as a lion, and the Sheriff of Nottingham, Robin's chief rival, as an Isengrim-like wolf. This Reynard-influenced film, with themes of resistance to corrupt authority, would in turn inspire Byron Howard, Rich Moore, and Jared Bush in writing Zootopia, which in its earliest drafts was told from the perspective of the cunning, opportunistic con artist fox Nick Wilde, in a sense carrying the torch of using the Roman de Renard to deliver socio-political commentary. Reynard's contemporary iterations and derivations vary wildly in their portrayals, as is fitting for one so flippant and mercurial. Today, the legendary fox and his spiritual successors are alternatively portrayed as a jovial trickster or malevolent sociopath, a common thief with a heart of gold, or a righteous champion of the oppressed, a shape-shifting mythological agent of chaos, or a particularly crafty but otherwise mundane human being. In many regards, nearly every trickster fox figure in contemporary Western culture owes at least some inspiration to Reynard's enduring popularity.
You really are kind of a quote-unquote fantastic fox.
I try.
Today, Reynard himself has largely faded from the public eye, much as his wild namesakes, who increasingly live alongside our own species, rarely reveal their presence for more than a fleeting moment. But even from the shadows, the fox continues to tug at the strings of our culture, which, perhaps, might be exactly the way the old trickster prefers it. In a world that continues to transform and evolve faster than ever before, where many ordinary people feel powerless in the face of injustice, corruption, hypocrisy, and complacency, and where the only constant is that of unceasing, unrelenting change, the legacy of this peculiar fox may provide a spark of hope that the tables will one day be turned. And in that regard, at least, the spirit of Reynard will continue to live on. Before I end this video, I'd like to give a special thanks to the wonderfully talented Kenket for allowing me to use her artwork in the thumbnail. If you are interested in seeing another take on the classic figure of Reynard, I myself have written 2 short stories inspired by the character, Darker Things Than Man and Riddles with a Raven, both of which have been featured on the Voice of Dog podcast. Additionally, my debut novel, Winter Without End, is now available from Fenris Publishing in both ebook and paperback format. a post-apocalyptic survival story about a dog who makes an uneasy alliance with a wounded wolf in order to survive. As always, links for everything will be in the description. Thanks for watching, and remember to keep your wits about you, for a fox will always sustain a fox.